Welcome back everyone to another spine-chilling episode. In today's video, we're diving into 3 real student horror stories where the lines between reality and the supernatural blur, and the scariest experiences happen in the very schools where we study and learn. These true stories come straight from students just like you who have lived through terrifying encounters that still haunt their memories. From shadowy figures in classrooms to unexplainable events in dorms, these stories will make you rethink your school's safety and what might be lurking just out of sight. Before we dive into the darkness, we want to express our heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of you for your incredible support. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions keep this channel alive and growing, and we couldn't do this without you. We appreciate you being part of our community and sharing in these eerie experiences. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and remember sometimes the scariest things happen in the places we least expect. Now, let's jump into today's terrifying stories. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Story 1: A Party of Horrors. There is something about that night that haunts me still. Something I can't quite grasp, as if the fabric of reality itself had unraveled at the edges, pulling me into a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. I remember it vividly how it started with the ordinary, the mundane, only to dissolve into something that no longer resembled the world I had known. It all began with a party, an invitation that had seemed harmless enough at first. We were 3: Bryson, Ian, and myself. Perhaps at the time we were no different from any other group of college students, though, in hindsight, I can't help but wonder if we were already marked, if our paths were already leading us somewhere we could neither anticipate nor understand. It had started innocently enough. A chance encounter with a fellow student on the campus green, a throwaway invitation to a party that we were too eager to refuse. It wasn't the kind of event that begged for attendance. It wasn't advertised with the typical flyers, nor was there any buzz about it in the student forums. And yet somehow there it was. An invitation pulled from the ether, as if it had been there all along, just waiting for us to notice. I'm not sure why we went. Maybe it was out of boredom. Maybe it was because we had nothing else to do. But the truth is, I felt a strange pull, an invisible force drawing me in, compelling me to follow through on what was, in hindsight, a terrible mistake. We arrived at the house, its towering silhouette looming in the night. It seemed to appear from nowhere, an island of strange affluence in a sea of ordinary, decaying homes. I could not remember having seen it before. It didn't fit in with its surroundings. It was too pristine, too immaculate, standing in sharp contrast to the crumbling buildings that surrounded it like a cemetery of suburban neglect. The front door swung open as if it were waiting for us, and we stepped inside with a sense of foreboding that I could not shake. The hallway stretched before us, long and oppressive. The walls were lined with portraits' faces, always watching us, their expressions too still, too serene. The house felt like a mausoleum, its silence a vacuum that sucked away any sense of warmth or human connection. Even the air itself seemed to have a different texture here, as though it had been preserved in some form of suspended animation, existing in a timeless void where the seasons had no bearing. The light above us was blinding in its harshness, like fluorescent sun, casting sharp shadows on the faces of the people gathered in the rooms ahead. There was no warmth in it, no life. The guests, if they could be called that, were strangers to me, and yet they were all somehow familiar. Their clothes were formal, too formal for a college party, as if they had just stepped out of a world I couldn't comprehend. Men in perfectly pressed suits, women in dresses that shimmered unnaturally under the artificial lights, their movements stilted and calculated. No one seemed to laugh. No one seemed to speak with genuine joy. Instead, they moved about like automatons, their eyes blank, their smiles fixed. They didn't belong to the world I knew, and I, in turn, did not belong to theirs. The music playing in the background was a discordant symphony of violins and piano chords that jarred the senses, a melody that should have been soothing but instead felt like a slow, aching wound. The music didn't match the environment. It was like listening to something that wasn't meant for human ears, a noise that belonged to a world just out of reach, a realm where the rules of sound and sanity had been discarded long ago. It made my skin crawl. At first, I tried to dismiss the discomfort creeping through my chest, attributing it to nothing more than my imagination, the discomfort of being in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by strange people. But as I glanced around, it became clear that this was no ordinary party. The people, those odd, still figures that I could no longer consider human, did not interact with us the way normal partygoers did. There was no friendliness, no banter, no casual introductions. Instead, they studied us, watched us from the corners of their eyes as if we were specimens to be observed, measured, cataloged. I turned to Bryson, hoping to find some sense of reassurance in his familiar face, but his expression was unreadable. He stood stiffly, his eyes darting across the room, as though he were trying to decipher something that he could not understand. I knew that I wasn't the only one feeling it, the unease, the oppressive weight of this place, the sense that something was wrong, something fundamental. "It's too quiet in here," Bryson muttered, almost to himself. His words hung in the air like an omen, and for a moment I wondered if he had read my thoughts. "I feel it too," I whispered back, my voice thin and tentative, as if speaking any louder might shatter the fragile silence that enveloped us. It was then that I saw her, the girl who seemed to be the epicenter of the strange energy in the room. At first, she appeared like any other partygoer, standing alone at the far end of the room. But the more I looked at her, the more out of place she seemed. There was a strange sort of radiance to her, an otherworldly glow that couldn't be explained by the harsh, unnatural lighting. Her features were striking, though I couldn't place why. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, but there was something about her, something that made her seem apart from the others. I found myself drawn to her, pulled toward her by an invisible force that I couldn't name. The closer I got, the more I noticed the green mark on her neck. At first, I thought it was just a bruise, a strange discoloration of the skin. But it was wrong. It shouldn't have been there, not on her neck, not in that shape. It was as if the mark was alien to her, a foreign body that had attached itself to her skin in some unholy way. As I stared at the mark, I noticed that it wasn't just on her. It was on others too, on several of the guests around the room. At first I thought my eyes were deceiving me, but no, it was there on their necks, in the same strange sickly hue. The mark was spreading, creeping from one person to another, like an infection that no one dared to acknowledge. I reached for Bryson, pulling him toward me, but he was already looking at the others. He saw it too. The green marks were everywhere now, like a silent plague that had taken hold of the guests, marking them with its unknown stain. "What the hell is going on here?" Ian asked, his voice shaking, and I could hear the panic rising in it. But Bryson didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the floor, his face pale, as if he too had seen something that was beyond his comprehension. I was about to ask him what was wrong when I saw him, the older man, standing off to the side, watching us with a quiet intensity. He had appeared out of nowhere, as if he had been waiting in the shadows all along. There was something unsettling about him, his clothes, his demeanor, everything about him screamed of a time that had long passed. He looked like someone who had wandered in from another era, an era where the world hadn't yet turned cold. And when he spoke, his voice was low and measured, as though he had chosen every word carefully. "Lista," he said, and the name struck me like a blow to the chest. My blood ran cold at the sound of it. I didn't know the name, not consciously. But it resonated within me like an echo from a distant dream, something I should have known but could not recall. The man's eyes never left mine as he spoke, and it was then that I realized he knew something about me. Something I didn't understand, something I had forgotten. "You will know her soon enough," he said, his words hanging in the air like an accusation. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. The walls were closing in on me, the strange stares of the guests like pressure from every angle. But Bryce and Ian, they didn't see it. They didn't understand. "Let's go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But Bryson and Ian didn't respond. Their eyes were distant, unfocused, as if they had already slipped away into that strange dream state that had claimed the others. I felt alone. Completely alone. We moved toward the door, but just as we reached it, I turned to look back. The girls who had watched us earlier stood by the door now, blocking our exit. Their smiles were too wide, too knowing, as though they had been expecting us, as though they had known the exact moment we would try to leave. "Leaving so soon?" one of them asked, her voice like honey, but it was cold. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. I felt a wave of panic surge within me, and I pulled Bryson and Ian toward the door, pushing through the crowd of figures whose eyes followed us like shadowed sentinels. But it was too late. The house was no longer just a house. It was something else now, a place where time had no meaning, where reality had no bearing, and where every movement, every word, every action was being watched, scrutinized, measured by forces I couldn't understand. And as we stepped into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind us, leaving us in darkness. The walls pulsed, and I could hear breathing in the walls. There was no escape. The party had already begun, and now we were part of it. Story 2: The Horrifying Secrets Inside a Stolen Backpack. I had always been meticulous. My life was a quiet, organized rhythm that revolved around my studies, my solitary routines in the small, enclosed world of my apartment at Purdue. When I moved here, I thought I would find a small pocket of peace in an otherwise busy and indifferent city. I was wrong. There are those who might call me paranoid, even obsessive, but I don't think that's the case. I simply sought order where there was none. I sought refuge from a world I no longer felt connected to, and I built my own reality, one where everything had a place and everything, no matter how small, was accounted for. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And I clung to it with the fragile intensity of a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. The first crack in this fragile cocoon came late in the autumn semester, just a few weeks after the semester began. I had left my backpack unattended in the study hall for only a brief moment, just long enough to go to the restroom. I was careful, perhaps obsessively so, with my belongings, but it was a moment of distraction. A mistake. And when I returned, the bag was gone. The weight of it only hit me as I walked back into the empty, echoing room. At first I assumed it was just misplaced. Perhaps someone had moved it, or perhaps I had forgotten where I left it. But as I searched the room, then the building, then campus security, I realized my backpack was simply gone. Vanished, as if it had never existed. The bag had been my lifeline. Inside it was my laptop, my research data, notes on the thesis I'd been meticulously constructing for years. There were journals too personal, hidden behind a lock of thoughts I didn't even want to confront. And worst of all, the keys to my apartment. The campus security officer, a tired man with red-rimmed eyes, nodded sympathetically when I reported the theft. But his words were hollow, his eyes glazed over with the dull disinterest that only those who deal with endless cases of petty theft could possess. "We'll keep an eye out," he said, but his voice held no conviction. It was clear that nothing would come of it, and nothing did. I had no reason to believe otherwise. But the theft was more than just an invasion of my property. It was a violation, an intrusion into a world that was meant to be mine, one that I had built, piece by piece, to keep me safe. The very nature of the theft gnawed at me, something insidious, like an invisible presence in the dark that made my skin crawl. They had not just stolen a backpack, they had stolen my sense of order, my understanding of the world. And that sense of invasion was the beginning. It started with the note. A week passed after the theft, the days slipping away like sand through my fingers. And then on the evening of the 7th day, I found a folded piece of yellowed paper slipped under my door. There was no envelope, no name, no indication of who had left it. Just the note. I see you. The handwriting was uneven, erratic, as if the writer had been in a rush or perhaps in a state of distress. The letters were sharp and jagged, as though the words themselves were scraping against the paper in a desperate attempt to escape. I couldn't shake the feeling that the words weren't meant for me at all, but for someone else, someone far more fragile, far more vulnerable than I could ever hope to be. Yet, I couldn't dismiss it. It lingered, insistent, in the quiet corners of my mind. I threw it away. Of course I did. What else could I do? But I could not forget it. The next note arrived 3 days later. It was shorter. The same handwriting, the same trembling urgency. Watch yourself. I laughed nervously when I found it. A joke, I thought. A student prank. Perhaps someone who had found out about the theft decided to amuse themselves at my expense. But deep down, I felt an unease that I couldn't shake. The laughter died quickly in my throat, replaced by a gnawing sense that this was more than a coincidence. It was only after the third note, "You're not safe," that I began to truly fear the implications. These were not the words of a prankster. These were words meant to erode my very sense of safety, to chip away at the foundation of my world. The feeling grew inside me, slow and insidious, like a shadow creeping into the corners of a room, making everything darker. Each note was slipped under the door. No one ever knocked. There were no signs of anyone, no footsteps outside my door, no familiar faces in the hallway. Whoever this was, they knew my movements. They knew when I was at home, when I was gone. They knew me in ways that should not have been possible. And then the fourth note arrived, slipping under my door in the dead of night, just hours before I was scheduled to leave for class. The note read, "I know where you live." By then, I had begun to look over my shoulder. Everywhere. I checked my apartment for signs of intrusion, every drawer, every cabinet, the closet. I even checked the back of the refrigerator. It was ridiculous, of course. There was nothing there, no sign that anyone had been inside, and yet the feeling persisted, the sense of being watched. The notes had morphed into something else now. They were not just messages, they were threats. The handwriting had become more erratic, as if the writer were losing control. The careful construction of the first note, a calculated message, had given way to something far more primal. A desperation, a need to be heard. The hand had trembled as it wrote, and the words seemed to carry with them a weight, a heaviness that threatened to crush the very air around me. I began to imagine things. I began to suspect that I was being watched from the windows, that there were eyes on me from the shadows of my apartment complex. I was aware of every sound, every scrape of a footstep down the hallway, every flicker of light outside my door. There was no escape. That's when I realized that the thief knew more than just where I lived. Whoever had taken my backpack had access to something far more important than my belongings. They had access to my privacy, my mind. They knew my routines. They knew my patterns. I started to wonder if I knew them. It wasn't until the break-in that the full horror became clear. One evening, after a long day of reading and writing, I returned to my apartment to find the door ajar. My heart thudded in my chest as I slowly approached, my pulse quickening with every step. The familiar sense of safety, of routine, had been torn away like a fragile veil. Inside, everything seemed off. At first it appeared untouched, no items missing, nothing out of place. But the atmosphere was wrong. The apartment felt thinner, like the walls were closing in on me, like the very air had thickened. A chair was out of place. The position of a book on the desk had been altered. And there, on my kitchen counter, I found a small scrap of paper, scrawled with a single word. Soon. Re. Whoever had been here had not taken anything of material value. No, the intrusion itself had been the statement. The dissonant message was the theft. The idea that something or someone had entered this space, this private world of mine, and had rearranged it in ways I could not even begin to comprehend. I called the police, but they were indifferent. What could they do? It was an old apartment complex. Break-ins happened all the time, they said. Mistaken identity, they said. But their faces betrayed their boredom. I was a case number, nothing more. My fear, my panic, was no more than a blip on their radar. The landlord was even worse. When I asked for the locks to be changed, he simply laughed. Nothing was taken, he said. Why spend the money? And so, I was left with nothing, no resolution, no answers. Only more notes, more moments of unease, more subtle shifts in my environment. It felt as though my entire world was slipping away, piece by piece, until only the terror remained. I stopped leaving my apartment. The world outside was no longer safe, and the walls of my apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a cage. I installed extra locks, but I knew they were meaningless. They would not keep the intruder out. The notes had escalated to something worse. I know your secrets, I'm always watching. I could feel the presence closing in on me. I had to confront it. I had to face the nameless terror that had been stalking me. But I never did. I waited and waited, but nothing happened. The notes stopped, the break-in ceased. But I was never alone again. Not truly. The silence in the apartment was deafening, and every creak of the floorboards felt like the weight of 1,000 eyes watching me. In the end, I suppose the thief never wanted anything from me after all. They didn't want my things. They wanted my mind. And now they had it. Story 3: My ex-boyfriend's obsession. There are times more frequent now that I wonder if it was all a mistake. If this life, this world, had always been a cruel jest, a twisted design that had been in motion long before I arrived at its center, before I had become its helpless, unwilling participant. Perhaps the creeping sensation that I've been cursed is the only rational response to it all. A rational response to a world so deeply unnatural that my mind aches trying to grapple with it. There's something foul in the air, in the walls, in the dark spaces between moments, and it gnaws at me at the edges of my existence, always pressing, always distorting. I am no longer certain of who I was or what I was. I am becoming something else, something far less human, and I think it's happening at the will of something outside of me. Something I cannot even name. I live in a dim, neglected apartment in the dorms of Temple University, a place that was once only a temporary dwelling for students on the cusp of adulthood. That was before. Now the apartment feels less like a home than a prison. Its chipped walls have a kind of tired dignity, faded wallpaper, stained carpets, the hum of a radiator working overtime, as if to stave off some cold, unseen force. The light in here is always dim, even when the lamps are on. The ceiling fans spin but never seem to stir the air. The atmosphere, no, the environment itself feels heavy, as though something is holding its breath in anticipation of a calamity that has already been set into motion. And the neighborhood, the buildings surrounding me, they hold their breath too. It's as if the whole world here waits for something. It waits for the rupture that will tear apart the facades of daily life. The silence is a prelude to something I can't fully understand, though I feel it stretching toward me, like a shadow lengthening in the dusk. It all began innocently enough, or perhaps it didn't. Ben, he was my first real relationship since I arrived at the university. A passing ephemeral thing at first, like the pleasant breeze of a summer afternoon that one might mistake for something more lasting. It didn't take long for that breeziness to curdle into something else, something far more unsettling. I began to notice things about Ben, small things, insignificant things at first, that began to change the air around him. The way he spoke, the oddity of his gestures, the way his gaze lingered just a bit too long when I wasn't looking. It was like he wasn't there in the room with me. but was instead moving through it as a thing apart, something that could not quite fit in the spaces he inhabited. But it wasn't until the end, when I broke up with him, that the true horror began to unfold. Or perhaps it was when I thought I had severed myself from him, when I thought I had rid myself of his peculiar weight, that I began to feel the world itself begin to shift and bend around me. I thought I was escaping, but in the end I was merely falling deeper into something darker, something more obscene. I lie in bed now, in the small hours of the morning, the room bathed in that faint glow from the streetlights outside, the same orange-pink haze that stains the world whenever night falls here. And still, there it is, the sound, the scraping, faint but persistent. It's not the wind, it's not the trees outside, there's something far closer, something that has crept in from a place I can't explain. It's as though the apartment itself, the building, the very foundation of this place has begun to wither, and the sounds of decay of something alive in the walls cannot be ignored. I can hear it now, scraping against the window, a sound that has no reason, no logic behind it, and yet I know it. I know it too well. It is Ben. But not Ben, not him anymore. It is something more, something that has taken a shape and twisted it beyond recognition. I tell myself that it's just my mind, that it's the aftershock of a bad breakup. But how can that be true? How can any of this be explained? It's beyond explanation. There are no answers for this. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself that it was just the aftermath of what had ended between us. Emotional noise, residual tension. It was inevitable. But then the noises, they became more pronounced, more insistent, like the scraping of nails against glass, like the breath of someone hiding just outside the corner of my vision. It was no longer just the scraping, though. Oh no, the sounds expanded. They stretched into something more hissing, a sharp intake of breath, and then there was the whisper. That voice. Came at night, of course. When the walls were thick with silence, when all other sounds had died away, his voice, a voice I had once known, once loved, now comes to me in distorted fragments. It's low, guttural, a voice barely discernible from the shadows. But it calls my name. It calls me by my name as if it is a curse. At first I tried to convince myself that it was just a product of my mind, of guilt, of unfinished business, but then the dreams began. I couldn't escape the dreams. I remember the first time it happened. I had just returned to my apartment after another exhausting day of classes. It was late, later than I intended. I was supposed to be preparing for a presentation, but my mind felt fractured, unhinged. I couldn't focus. I could barely keep my thoughts together long enough to form sentences. But then, something else broke through. I was standing in front of the class, words spilling from my mouth in a garbled haze, when the projector clicked on, almost as if it had a life of its own. I don't even remember setting it up, but there it was, the image, flickering, distorted. There he was, Ben, or something like him, dressed in black, standing before a backdrop of what seemed to be a vast, empty void. A figure draped in shadow, his face obscured by a mask, but the voice, it was unmistakable. You think you're safe at rasp, the words distorted, as if they were coming from the belly of the earth. You think you can escape. The room was silent. The faces of my classmates seemed to blur, to bend out of focus, as though the world was folding in on itself. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused to move. I couldn't look away. The voice, it was so familiar, too familiar, and it spoke of things that no one should know. It's all connected, it whispered. You are part of it. The government knows. They are watching you. It was impossible. I couldn't breathe. My head swam. It didn't make sense. And yet there was no denying it. The things it spoke of, my things no one else could have known, were being laid bare before me. The videos, the photos, my life, my private life, scattered across the screen like a twisted puzzle, a game, a mockery of everything I had believed to be true. I don't remember much after that. The room was a blur. I could feel the eyes of my classmates on me, but they were like shadows, silent, unmoving. They were in on it, they knew, and yet they did nothing. They said nothing. When I finally left the classroom, My heart was hammering in my chest. The walls seemed to move with me, closing in, breathing with me. I rushed back to my apartment, my sanctuary, if it could still be called that. I thought I had escaped it, but no. The noises, the scraping, the scratching at the window, the whispering voice, it was worse now, more insistent. I had to know who did this to me. I had to find out. I buried myself in my phone, scrolling through my social media accounts, desperate to make sense of it all. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, my eyes strained, my mind unraveling with every tap of the screen. I found nothing at first, just the usual, the mundane, but then the posts. Buried, hidden old, Ben's posts, the photos, the details, my phone number, my address. I felt my pulse quicken as I clicked through the images. How had he gotten them? How had he known? There was no answer. The question didn't matter anymore. It had already happened. He had been watching me, stalking me, trapping me in a web of surveillance, of data, of twisted voyeurism. He had mapped my life in a way I hadn't even realized was possible. And all the while, he was nothing more than a presence in the darkest shadow waiting for me to stumble into it. The worst part, the truly unbearable part, was that I didn't. As we wrap up today's video featuring 3 real student horror stories, we want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for your incredible support. We hope that these unsettling tales kept you on the edge of your seat and that the fear lingered long after the screen went dark. It's your engagement, your likes, comments, and shares that makes this channel what it is, and we are endlessly grateful for every one of you. If these stories gave you goosebumps, don't forget to hit that like button. Share your thoughts with us in the comments, and make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next bone-chilling video we have in store. We love hearing from you, so keep those eerie experiences and thoughts coming. Remember, the world is full of things that go bump in the night, and sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones we see, but the ones we feel lurking just out of sight. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and never forget some shadows aren't cast by the sun. Stay alert, stay healthy, and keep your doors locked tight. We'll be back with more stories to make you question what's really hiding in the dark. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.